Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler episode 202. Today the Amateur Traveler talks about ruins, Buddhas, and tea as we go to Sri Lanka.
One more cathedral, I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I do have three news stories for you. The first one struck me as odd. It's not exactly a travel story, but Nigeria may have been sending you some emails saying that they have millions of dollars they'd like to move into the country, the famous Nigerian phishing scam, but they got very upset when Sony mentioned the phrase, "You can't believe everything you read on the internet, otherwise it'd be a Nigerian millionaire by now," and they're demanding an apology from the company. Yeah, I don't think that's very likely. In another story, there was a list that came out of the 10 safest countries in the world to visit, and the leader was New Zealand. I don't know if they noticed that New Zealand, the home of bungee jumping, they like to jump off of tall things. I'm thinking they didn't factor that into their equation. And then Hyatt showed us how to damage a brand name. They decided to fire their modestly paid workers who clean the rooms and replace them with a contract firm, but before they did that, they had them train their replacements as, quote, vacation replacements. The good news is you get to go on vacation. The bad news is you can't come back. For links to those news stories and others, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Karl Anders from Spokane, who's come to talk to us about Sri Lanka. Karl, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here.
Now, Sri Lanka is not a very common destination. You have traveled there a number of times, as I recall.
Yeah, I was there 8 times over a course of about 13 or 14 years.
And the story of why is interesting. Why were you traveling to Sri Lanka?
Well, a very dear friend of mine, Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, lived in Sri Lanka. And so the purpose of the trips were primarily to visit Arthur, to spend time with him and get to know him better. And that was very successful. He was a terrific guy. We had lovely times and became very good friends. But while I was there, I also took the opportunity to explore this kind of remote and quite intriguing place. Their tourist board calls it a land like no other, and I think that's probably a fair description of Sri Lanka.
I was enjoying some of the pictures that you sent along, which people will be seeing throughout this episode if they're watching on iTunes or an iPhone or an iPod. And they do look like a place like no other. Tell us a little bit about what's going to stand out for me when I first come to Sri Lanka. What am I going to notice first that's different?
Well, coming from San Jose, you're going to be awfully tired by the time you get there.
That's true.
It's literally at the other end of the world, and it takes just about a full solid day of traveling, just like when you went to Africa. It's quite fatiguing. So when you get there, you're going to be very jet-lagged. You're going to probably arrive after midnight. Most of the planes flying from America arrive there in the wee hours of the morning. There's going to be a lot of hustle and bustle at the airport. You're going to grab a cab or have a driver waiting for you, get to your hotel in Colombo, and rest the evening and then wake up, and that's where your adventure really will begin, is the second day, because you'll be pretty tired getting there that day. Colombo itself is, for me, was important because that's where Arthur lived, so I spent a fair number of days there, but it is a large third-world city with a few interesting things to see and do, but it's mostly a place to get from rather than as a destination. The beauty of Sri Lanka lies around the island, not in the big city of Colombo, in my opinion.
Now, one thing we should say before we go on too much further, I notice you are not pronouncing it the same way that I am. I'm used to saying Sri Lanka, but you're saying Sri Lanka.
I'm sure all is fine. It's gone by so many names over the centuries. Ceylon, Serendip, all these are synonyms. So however you say it, people will understand. The people there say Sri Lanka.
Okay.
Where to go from Colombo? Well, it depends a lot on what your interests are. Why to go there might be another question. I think for me, obviously, the motivating factor was to see a guy who'd been one of my boyhood heroes and one of my favorite writers. But beyond that, Sri Lanka offers, I think, stuff that's interesting for people who are sort of in the area or even people who just want to go there, although it is a far way to go. But if you were in Southeast Asia, I think I would take the week and look at adding Sri Lanka on as a destination. It has beautiful beaches, like many, many other islands, but there are some phenomenal beaches. There's great diving and snorkeling and surfing if you want to do that. But a lot of other places have those as well. But if you were a beach person, certainly you could entertain yourself for hours on end at the beaches. I would recommend getting a car, arranging a car and driver, which in Sri Lanka is surprisingly inexpensive. When I did it, I don't know if there was ever a day it cost me more than $60 to have a car and driver who's also acting as your guide and interpreter. Take you around the island, and you can enjoy the scenery, sit back, and not have to worry about the chaotic traffic on the road. So that would be something I would really recommend people if they're going to go there. Don't try to hoof it. Don't bother with the trains, which are chaotic and don't work well, or buses or anything like that. Take the money and get yourself a car and driver. You'll be glad you did. It'll be a great experience, much better experience for you if you go that way. So where to go? So the beaches are one option, and like I say, they have some world-class diving. In fact, that was one of the things that attracted Arthur Clarke there, was the great coral reefs and phenomenal sea life of Sri Lanka. I was most surprised by, I think, the variety of the archaeology on the island. And it's something we don't hear a lot about or think a lot about, but it's been an island that's been inhabited for thousands of years. The history predates Christ, predates Buddha. And there are relics and ruins that go back for thousands of years, mostly in the center and in the mid-northern part of the island. That, to me, was a surprise and a real highlight, was seeing some of these ancient places.
What sort of ruins are there? Are these religious artifacts, or are these houses, villas, temples, palaces?
All of the above. Probably, Sri Lanka is mostly a Buddhist country. About 75% of the people on the island are Sinhalese or Buddhists. There are about 10 or 15% are Tamils or Hindu. Maybe 5 or 10% are Muslim, and Christians and others are 1 or 2%. They're a small minority. For hundreds of years, Sri Lanka was sort of an example to the world on how all these people of different faiths could live together in harmony. But that all came apart in the 1950s by a kind of stupid act by the government at the time, who imposed the Buddhist language. Sinhalese is the sole language, and only Buddhist Sinhalese people could work in the government. That's at least as I understand it. And There was a rebellion that was suppressed violently and that escalated to what became a pretty nasty civil war that looks like it's finally over.
Well, that was the one question I want to ask. We were talking about where to go.
Yeah.
And my first question was where not to go because of the unrest that has been there. Yeah. I hadn't heard that it was over, and I guess that was really what I wanted to talk about.
The areas that you traditionally wouldn't go, and probably I wouldn't go there for a couple of years because they were really quite devastated by the war. Mm-hmm. The very northern part of the island is pure Tamil part. That's Jaffna. And that was where the war ended by the government killing the rebel leader and his son and most of the officials that were involved in the rebellion. I do think that this time they went Roman and killed him, and I think it's probably over. The northeastern part of the island was also pretty much a Tamil stronghold, so those areas were not wise to travel to. Mm-hmm. The rest of the island I felt very safe in. The violence was not directed against tourists. It was purely political. It was totally directed against the government, so the parliament buildings, gatherings of politicians, these were all legitimate targets to the Tamils, and unless you happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, I really didn't feel unsafe there. I always felt pretty comfortable wherever I went there.
Okay.
But I think we digress from the question of what to see. Mm-hmm. The archaeology, there's some fascinating places. There is a lot of religious stuff like I was alluding to before I went off on my tangent. But for example, in Dambulla, Dambulla, there are historic caves which go back thousands of years, and there are ancient Buddha figurines and shrines and stuff like that in a series of 7 caves built together. Fascinating place to see. So that was interesting. But the single most unique site in Sri Lanka is a place called Sigiriya, Sigiriya, Sigiriya. Mm-hmm. And that is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that is a fascinating place. Arthur used it as a backdrop for one of his books, The Fountains of Paradise. And the fountains that were built here in the 5th century are still working remarkably. That was built by the king at the time. And Sigiriya is a large rock monolith. It's maybe, 400 or 500 feet high. It has, at the top, maybe there's 50 acres at the top. I might be overestimating that. He, in his mind, thought to be safe, he had to live on top of this monolith where they could completely retract, and they had a pool of water and food up there to last them for months on end. And he figured if he ever was attacked and people managed to make it through his 2 series of moats and elaborate system of defenses, there was no way they could reach him at the top of Sigiriya. So he built this incredibly complicated city on the mountain, on the monolith, and sprawling around in the grounds around it with barriers of defense, like I said, a couple of moats and walls. And you can see the ruins of all this, and some of them are really remarkably well preserved. Best known of the site are 2 things. One are 5th century frescoes. They're painted in the caves, and they're of Sri Lankan maidens, and they're really beautiful paintings to see. My photos of them didn't turn out, which is why I didn't send you any of those, Chris, but they're really quite magnificent. At the base of where you have to ascend quite steeply to the top of the monolith was a massive lion carved out of rock. And the paws and body of the lion remain, but the head part was made out of bricks, and that's crumbled. But for a primitive people, if you put yourself back at this very sacred, special site, to walk through the mouth of a lion, this lion was a sacred animal to these people, in to see the king at the top in his palace would have been a humbling experience. And it still is very impressive to see. And then at the top of Sigiriya, there are still lots of ruins of buildings, and you can see the royal court area where the king would have sat on his throne and the pool and stuff. And the view from up there is absolutely breathtaking. I mean, you see jungle. You might even see elephants walking down in the jungle. Just a pristine view. So that is the one place. If I was going to go one place in Sri Lanka, I would recommend Sigiriya. My only caveat to that would be it's not for people who have really bad vertigo.
Okay.
So if you are really scared of heights, then I don't recommend this place.
Well, and am I walking to the top?
You will be walking, and it'll be fairly hot and humid. It'll be in the 80s. Humidity will be about 80. Take water with you. You walk in. The walk probably, the total thing is probably 3 or 4 miles to do the whole thing. You're walking in on the grounds. You're walking up the side of the rock monolith of Sigiriya. Mm-hmm. You'll be stopping in and seeing some of the different ruins. And then you'll be climbing ladders to go to the top, which are very safe. But you will get the feeling a little bit of being exposed. I personally don't like heights that much, but I could handle that okay. But there are some people who would have trouble with vertigo, so that's something to keep mind. What else to see? Well, another great city is a city called Anuradhapura, and I better spell that. These Sri Lanka names are really tough. Anuradhapura.
Okay.
And this is one of the older cities in Sri Lanka, and they have historic sites. The old kingdom used to be in this city before it got moved around. And you will see huge Buddhist stupas where great religious teachers have died. There's a tree, a boa tree, that was allegedly planted by the Buddha, which is still alive, very sacred to the Buddhist people in Sri Lanka. You will see the ruins of the old castle, the old Temple of the Tooth, and things like that. So that's a neat city to visit as well. And the third city, as far as archaeology goes, that I'd recommend is a city called Polonnaruwa, Polonnaruwa. This is a medieval city. It was built around the 13th and 14th century. And it has very extensive ruins, very well preserved because it is relatively recent. But those three cities, Sigiriya, Anuradhapura, and Polonnaruwa, are known as the cultural triangle of Sri Lanka. And some fascinating archaeology to be seen there. The last thing is, of course, the tea country.
Right.
The number one export of Sri Lanka is tea. The tea is a legacy of the British colonial era. Surprisingly, actually, the Sri Lankan people are not bitter about having been colonized by the British because the infrastructure of trains, roads, and tea were left by the British. And because of that, Sri Lanka functions quite well. Anyway, there are massive tea plantations. It's a small island. It's about 200 miles long, 120 or so miles wide. But in the middle of this island, there are mountains that go well above 10,000 feet, quite steep peaks. And draped over these massive mountains are hundreds and thousands of acres of tea. And it is a neat thing to drive through, to see. The views are great. There's all kinds of tea factories along the way that you can stop at whenever you want and have a free cup of tea. And, of course, they want you to buy a little bit of tea before you go, but that is a neat thing to do. So the high mountain country, the hill country of Sri Lanka, certainly is well worth seeing. So those are the three things that I sort of took with me: the beaches and the water activities of the island, the archaeology, and then lastly, the hill country with the tea.
Now, we didn't say when you should visit, and I know Sri Lanka has some definite times that I might want to avoid.
I was there during the monsoon season, and the monsoon season, I don't know how it is in India, but typically the rains would start after supper in the evening time. It would rain heavily an hour or two, very heavily. And the days were pretty nice. It might be a little cloudy, but I didn't really run into bad weather. So it is just about on the equator, so there's not a lot of variation in climate. So I would go just about any time. I don't think that weather is that big an issue. For me, the best time is to get away from winter. So I like to go in January and February because it was so lovely and tropical to be there then.
And when is the monsoon season?
I think it's in the summertime. I think I want to say something like June to August or so.
Okay.
But I'm not 100% sure. But you can get showers at any time in the year. It's not quite as dry as India's because it is sticking out and surrounded by water much more so than the subcontinent of India is.
Okay. And having been there 8 times, what do the guidebooks recommend that you thought was a little disappointing? And conversely, what did they leave out?
The guidebook I mostly used was The Lonely Planet. I think there's maybe a couple of others out now. I found that to be pretty much on. I didn't find a lot of things that I didn't see. Like I say, the one thing I wouldn't spend is a lot of time in Colombo, unless you have reason to be there. You're going to need to be in Colombo at the beginning, at the end of the trip. If you want to add a day on to see the city, that's all you need. There's actually a neat store in Colombo called Odell's. So that's a place that's not in the guidebook, and that's a place, if you ever go there, is well worth shopping. It's sort of an upscale outlet for the textiles of the country. There's a lot of textiles. Textiles, I think, is a second industry in the country.
Silk or what sort of textiles?
You can buy high-quality, beautiful T-shirts with Sri Lanka logo and all kinds of things for $2 or $3 each.
Oh, okay.
Things like that. And quality Calvin Klein shirts at outlet prices and stuff like that. That's a place that's worth going if you want to shop for clothes and things along that line. But as I say, Colombo for me was a place to visit Arthur. I had a nice hotel that I stayed at there, the Galle Face Hotel. And that, while I'm on that, there are a string of old British-era colonial hotels on the island.
Okay.
And it is well worth anybody who likes that sort of experience, being in a hotel that's about 150 years old and mostly still in a nice state of repair, but with that grandeur of bygone era. There are some excellent hotels like that. And the Galle Face is the one in Colombo. It is right on the Indian Ocean, and some of the most beautiful sunsets I've seen in my life were sitting there in the court with a drink of my choice, often a lime soda, but once in a while a beer, and just watching the sun go and the clouds that are playing with the light. It was a special place to see that.
Okay.
And there are others as well. So I would recommend people, if they want to go there, make an effort to try to stay at these. They're inexpensive by our standards. $60 a night up will get you a room in these places. Food is quite reasonably priced by Western standards. It is a neat experience. I love that kind of place to stay.
And you say food. Is the food heavily influenced by India, which is right there, or what is the Sri Lankan food like?
It is mostly curries and Indian-type dishes, but with their own little flair. And, of course, also other end of the spectrum, British dishes, roast beef, things like that. So there is the British influence. At breakfast, you'll mostly see that, bacon and eggs if you want, things like that.
Okay.
And curries. Any time of day you want, they will have a tantalizing selection of curries. A lot of seafood in the curries because of the abundance of the fisheries off the island.
Sure.
Food was excellent. I can't say I ever had a bad meal in Sri Lanka. It was really tasty food. Sometimes a little spicier than I wanted, but you learn to work through it.
And did you have a favorite either upscale or hole-in-the-wall place?
Well, when I travel, I try to be pretty careful because once in my life I got traveler's diarrhea.
Okay.
And nothing can spoil a trip quicker than that. So when I eat, I try to be pretty fussy about where I eat. In Colombo, I mostly ate at the Galle Face Hotel.
Okay.
They have superb standards. It was to the point where I had salads, everything. I had no problem. Excellent chef, good kitchen. So most ate there. The Taj Hotel, which is right across the street from the Galle Face, also had an excellent kitchen. And there were a number of places I ate with expats that knew where to go, but I'd be careful about walking into a mom-and-pop place, and if I was to go there, I'd be very selective about what I'd eat.
Okay.
Everything would have to be cooked well.
And you talk about the Galle Face Hotel. I'm getting this picture of other British tropical colonial area hotels like Raffles in Singapore, Long Bar. Okay.
It's
Dark
like
Woods.
Raffles, exactly.
Okay.
Except instead of $500 a night, it'll be $50 or $60 a night.
All right.
Yeah.
And you said to get around, you're recommending a driver. We didn't say how expensive that was.
I don't know what it is today because gas has spiked in the last couple of years. But when I was doing it, it would depend on the distance. And it was, on average, I'd say $60 a day for a car and driver and fuel. The hotels have free accommodations for the drivers and free food. So if you stay at one of these places, your driver is well cared for. He gets a room, he gets a meal. As I say, they're nice people. You're talking about the guidebooks. One of the things that they don't tell you is how nice the people of Sri Lanka are. They're shy people. And once you start talking to them, they're very friendly people. Big, warm smiles, just very hospitable culture, but very shy at first. They will never approach you. If you see a Sri Lankan coming at you, smiling and waving at you, he wants something from you. He's probably a tout or a hustler, so stay away from him.
And just because we have listeners who are on more of a backpacker budget, any recommendation if that's a little pricey? You say the buses and the trains are more challenging.
They're more challenging. They rarely run on time. I mean, there are definitely trains that run, and they're very inexpensive. I mean, $1 will get you halfway across the country.
Okay.
But it'll be very crowded, it'll be very hot, and it'll be less pleasant. Buses will go to the more remote places where the trains really can't go well. And again, very inexpensive. And I would definitely, if you're going to backpack, make sure you have the Lonely Planet guide. There are a lot of inexpensive mid-scale accommodations from a few dollars a night to $15, $20 a night. Plenty of places like that in Sri Lanka. And for $20 a night, you can get a pretty nice room just about anywhere on the island. Okay. So it's still a fairly inexpensive place to stay.
Now, you took a lot of pictures and some gorgeous pictures. What picture or pictures just really puts you back in Sri Lanka? That just really captured the country for you?
First and foremost, the sunsets at the Galle Face Hotel, a couple of which I included for you, was something I saw probably 25 or 30 times, and it was always special. So for me, that was a big part of the experience. Sitting in one of these tea factories, drinking a cup of delicious, freshly brewed, world-class bright orange Pico tea served to you in this beautiful white china cup, and looking at the mist shrouding over the hills of the hill country, that was a very memorable part to me. And again, the ruins. I have these three distinct things in my memory of Sri Lanka. Sitting on top of Sigiriya, there was one time I was there. I was there 4 times on these trips. And one time I was there just before dusk. The sun was just starting to set. And I was the only person on top of Sigiriya. And I had the whole place to myself with this phenomenal view of the jungle and the ruins, and the light was getting soft, and that pearly way that John Steinbeck talks about. And it was just a terrific moment. One of my most memorable travel moments was sitting alone on this UNESCO World Heritage Site watching the sunset. That was great.
And of course, you always make points with a boy who grew up in Salinas when you quote John Steinbeck. So,
well, one of my favorite chapters ever, since we're talking about this, and you can edit this out if you want, but in Cannery Row, he talks about these people sitting on a thing in the hour of the pearl, and the way the light played on the bay and the Cannery Row and stuff. Just one of my favorite ever written pieces of literature is that book and that chapter specifically.
Interesting. You mentioned talking with your driver. Language, how much of an issue to get around? I'm assuming you're not speaking, and I don't know what the language is called.
Yeah, the main language is Sinhalese.
Sinhalese, okay.
The Buddhist. I picked up very few words. It's a very tough language to learn. And again, it's a former British colony, so there is English in everybody's education. It's a very well-educated island, just about, I want to say 90 or 95% literacy rate. Everybody goes to school. Now that the war is hopefully over, the country will really boom, but that really kept it back. But everybody in the tourist places will speak some English. You'll get by as well as you would in many parts of Europe. As you get into the remote areas, as with many places, you will run into people who have some trouble, and that's where the driver comes in well. If you want to buy something, he'll help you negotiate the price and so on.
And as long as we're talking about locals, who's the most memorable person you met there?
Well, for me, of course, it was Arthur C. Clarke.
I'm thinking of from the island. But
from the island, I met many fascinating people through Arthur. One of the most interesting characters I met there was a guy named Hans Mohemius, who was a Dutchman. And he worked forever at Unilever in their tropical woods division in Indonesia, and had spent some time in Sri Lanka as well and retired here. And he and Arthur became good friends, and he became a friend of mine. Hans was a character. And talk about a photographer. He was an amateur pro. He just did some beautiful photography. I spent many hours in his photo album room looking at pictures, and we would reminisce about different trips we'd been on. It was a good friendship that I developed with Hans.
Now, you'd mentioned how far it is to Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
I'd like you to think about the moment that you felt the furthest from home and the moment you felt closest to home in Sri Lanka.
Well, I think the moment I felt furthest from home was my very first trip there. I left my wife and 2 kids. They were fairly small at the time. I was going to a country where I knew there was a civil war. I was tired, and I get there, and there was a tremendous amount of security at the airport at that time because the civil war had flared up. And literally just about every mile on the road, there's a military checkpoint. And despite the hustle and bustle of the traffic, I said, holy moly, I said, this is really another world here. And I wasn't quite sure what I'd gotten myself into. Having said that, there was never any sort of danger. The country was quite safe, unlike Egypt, where the violence is directed against tourists, for example. In Sri Lanka, it was completely political. It was very much a religious war between Hindus and Buddhists.
You said Hindus. I was thinking the
Tamils, yeah. The Tamils are a Hindu, yeah.
Okay.
The Tamil Tigers are Hindu, and the Sinhalese majority, they're Buddhist. So it was really based on those language and religious divisions that the war was fought. Let's see, when did I feel closest? I felt most at home, sitting in Arthur's home, having a cup of tea with him in his study, or having a bowl of tomato soup, which is the kind of bland stuff Arthur liked to eat.
And why does a man who likes bland stuff end up in a country like Sri Lanka?
And eating tomato soup. I don't know. But that was Arthur for you. That was his favorite lunch dish, was tomato soup and dry toast. The hospitality of that man and his kindness and warmth to me were where I felt most at home. He was a remarkable, kind-hearted, terrific man, and I feel blessed that I had the chance to know him, and I feel blessed that I had a chance to visit with him.
Okay. Before you went there the first time, what do you wish you had known?
I almost went there spur of the moment the first time. And the first time I wish I had prepared myself a little bit better. It was at Arthur's insistence that I went to Sigiriya on the first trip, and I did it as a long day trip. And it was a little bit tiring, but it was well worth seeing. So I think I just wish I had prepared. And in the last 15 or so years, I've become more sophisticated in my travels. I almost never go without having done at least a few dozen hours of research on the place I'm going to go to. And you try to learn a few words of the language and to have some logistics worked out beyond just the hotel that I stayed at.
And best resources for planning a trip to Sri Lanka, as long as we're talking about preparation?
For me personally, it was a friend of mine. This was the man that introduced me to Arthur. It was a former VOA officer, a guy named Wayne Hauser. I don't think he'd mind if I use his name. He had lived there for 3 years, and he knew the ins and outs of the island very well. But for most people, I would recommend use the Lonely Planet guidebook.
Okay.
That's your best resource, and it's really pretty spot on, the parts of it that I used.
Okay. As we go to wind this down, finish this sentence for me. You really know you're in Sri Lanka when what?
When you're the only white face having tea in a crowd of 1,000 people.
All right.
Of course, tea is the beverage, yeah.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And you don't feel ill at ease. You feel very much at ease doing that, yeah.
And excellent. And if you had to describe Sri Lanka in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Boy, I hate to sound like an advertising agency, but a land like no other. Land like no other. That's 4 words, but...
We'll give you 4.
I think that's as good a slogan for it. It really is a pretty unique place. And again, if you're in Vietnam or Thailand or India, I would take a look at taking a week and popping down to Sri Lanka. You might have a nice time there.
Excellent. Karl, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing with us your love of Sri Lanka.
My pleasure. And again, Chris, thank you for the nice service you provide to myself and the tens of thousands of other people that listen to your podcast.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
I have a new internet resource for you, and this is one from the Amateur Traveler, and that's a new blog about travel contests. If you're a contest fan and you want to see if you can win a trip, go to entertowinatrip.amateurtraveler.com, and hopefully you will. If you do, certainly let me know. In news from the community, I heard a while back from Kathy, who left a comment on the episode about traveling to Venice and the Veneto, and she said, it took me one Vaporetto ride down the Grand Canal to fall in love with Venice, one of the world's magical places. But I was surprised that you gave the impression that unless you can spring for $300 plus for a hotel room, you should stay somewhere else and day trip. Venice is a very different place at night. It's worth at least a couple of nights and more if possible, and there's no need to spend $300. Some general money-saving tips: do not stay close to St. Mark's. Besides being expensive, the only place that might attract bigger crowds is the Rialto Bridge. Venice is small enough and has enough vaporetti that there's no need to stay there. Second, go in the off-season. In July and August, hotel prices tend to drop because the temperatures and humidity are likely to be miserable. But the first or second week of November, they drop more noticeably. I spent 6 nights there in November of 2007, had a great time, and paid €80 a night for an en-suite single in Dorsoduro. Third, consider B&Bs instead of hotels. Oh, and it will help to be willing to do without a canal view. You can't see it when you're asleep. For cheaper lodgings, look at sawdays.co.uk and Rick Steves' Lonely Planet, etc. guidebooks. I also found Burano a much prettier island than Murano. It's easy to visit both. Thank you, Kathy, for your great tips, and I'll put a link in the show notes over to Kathy's comment on that episode. Violet left a comment on the show on Lao and said, great episode. He's right about the authenticity of Lao. The people didn't seem to be as into getting attention from visitors or becoming Western as much as the Thai people do. I went to Vientiane to get a visa for teaching in Thailand, and I was pleasantly surprised. I would have loved to have stayed longer if I hadn't already planned to live in Thailand. I also love the diversity of Vientiane. There were Koreans, Chinese, Thai people. It seemed like a melting pot. I hope to visit again someday. Thanks for your great show. And thank you for your comment, Violet. With that, we'll bring this episode to an end. If you have a comment, like Kathy or Violet, you can leave it on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com, or you can send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. I need to get packing because I'm heading out tomorrow to Mexico, the 3rd time this year, for I think my 15th or 16th trip down there to build houses with a group called Esperanza. If you'd like more information about that, you can check out one of the older video episodes of The Amateur Traveler where I show some video that'll show you what I'll be doing while I'm down there. As always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should